Punctuation is the theme of this lecture. We're going to be talking about how to use it, why it's important in terms of the band descriptors, and the difference between informal and formal letter punctuation. So let's get started thinking again about those band descriptors. If we take another look, we can see that in band 6 we are told that the writer makes some errors in grammar and punctuation, but they rarely reduce communication. Whereas band 7 tells us the writer has good control of grammar and punctuation, but may make a few errors. Now notice that in band 7 there is one telling difference between band 6, and that is the issue of communication. So band 6 tells us that the writer rarely reduces communication, which means, a couple of times it might happen, but on the whole it doesn't. But band 7 doesn't mention it at all. Okay, so such reduced communication is not even mentioned by band 7. This suggests that at no point can your grammar or punctuation confuse the reader. If you confuse the reader with your punctuation or your grammar, you're going to lose marks and you potentially may be limited to a band 6. If you can confuse the reader with your vocabulary, you may be limited to a band 6 in vocabulary, but not necessarily grammar. And you can make mistakes in your grammar without causing confusion, but it's that confusion aspect that's very, very important. Make sure your communication is crystal clear, or as clear as you can make it. Punctuation has a big impact on this, and we need to make sure our punctuation is accurate so as to avoid this sense of confusion. Now, in formal letters on the whole, you should use exactly the same type of punctuation as you would when writing your task 2 essay, at least within the content of the letter. Of course, remember to put a comma after the recipient's name, like hi Matt, comma, and then a comma at the end of the letter after yours sincerely or kind regards, for example, and then finish with your name. But on the whole, you should use exactly the same punctuation as you would in an essay. There are some common mistakes which are generally made, and these do need to be acknowledged. You particularly need to know for yourself whether you are making these mistakes. However, I've already talked about these mistakes in a 13-minute lecture in my Task 2 course. So as I've mentioned before, I don't want to repeat content, so I'm not going to repeat that content here. However, you can watch that Task 2 video even if you haven't taken that course, as I have made that a free lecture to access. So if you want to learn about how to use apostrophes, how to use capital letters, and other things, do check out lecture 24 of Mastering IELTS Writing Task 2. As I said, it's free, so you've got nothing to lose. But for now, we're going to really just think about the use of informal letter punctuation. That's where punctuation becomes slightly different from the Task 2 band descriptors and Task 2 writing in general and formal letter writing. So, in contrast to formal letters, the essay in Writing Task 2 and the academic modules version of Writing Task 1, you can be a bit more varied in your use of punctuation in informal letters of general training, Writing Task 1. Exclamation marks, contractions, ellipses, parentheses. So these are 4 different things we're going to look at that involve punctuation, and just so that we know exactly what the signs are for each of them, exclamation mark looks like this. A contraction isn't punctuation itself, but it uses punctuation. It's like combining do and not together to create the expression don't, or I and am to create I'm, and the punctuation you see there is an apostrophe. Ellipses is just the 3 dots, the 3 periods if you use American English, the 3 full stops if you use British English at the end of a sentence. Parentheses, otherwise known as brackets, open bracket, close bracket, and we'll be learning about how to use each of these in informal letters, but on the whole you should never be using any of these when you are in Writing Task 2. If you're extremely confident, you may get away with using parentheses, but you really shouldn't need to. Okay, so let's have a look at each one in turn. Let's start with exclamation marks. Now what they are punctuation marks which express an exclamation, and an exclamation is just a surprise or an indication of a strong emotion. Let's have a look at some appropriate usage. I'm so happy to hear you got the job. Congratulations. You can hear that emotion in my voice. sort of repressed a little bit because I'm British, but on the whole, there's this strong emotion coming through, and we would signify that with an exclamation mark at the end. You can see there's two together. It's perfectly fine to do so. Both of those expressions, sentences, are communicating strong emotion. I never could have done it without you. Again, strong emotion. We want to signify that we're really happy, so we're going to add that exclamation mark on the end. Now, where might it not be appropriate? A sentence like, I feel deeply upset at the way you have acted. There might be strong emotion here because of this deeply upset nature, but it's just not appropriate because we want to deliver a more serious, somber tone here. Serious, informal maybe, but still serious because we're hurt. If you add an exclamation mark at the end, it almost devalues or excessively dramatizes the emotion that you're feeling. It would be much better to finish this sentence with a full stop. A full stop is actually weightier here, I feel. It would actually make a stronger impression. I'm sorry for not writing sooner. This, we're saying I'm sorry for not writing sooner. There's hardly a strong emotion involved. Maybe we should have written sooner, but we don't want to put an exclamation mark here, as it's just a more casual expression. We're just apologizing. Okay, let's think about contractions. Contractions are single words which are created by squeezing two separate words into one word by way of an apostrophe. So appropriate use, how have you been instead of how have you been. I'll call you later in the week instead of I will call you later in the week, and you should have told me about your plans instead of you should have told me about your plans. There are many more opportunities for contractions than I think a lot of people realize. So if you are unsure about contractions, I'd recommend doing a little bit of research on Google about contractions in English so that you can make sure you take advantage of every opportunity where they arise in your informal letter. The only inappropriate use is if you were to use them in any formal letter. Make sure you never do this. Even in a semi-formal letter, I would recommend using no contractions. Any other inappropriate use is just a case of getting them wrong, spelling them inaccurately, and that's more about inaccurate use rather than inappropriate use. Aim for consistency. Very important point. If you start by using contractions in your informal letter, do try to take every opportunity to use contractions throughout. Otherwise, it could be argued that you don't have a consistent tone, and although it may not make as much of an impact on your grammar score, it could have an impact on your task achievement score. For the reasons that we looked at in the task achievement section, you need to have a consistent tone as well as an appropriate tone. Moving on now to ellipses, and ellipses are the use of three dots to indicate the omission of language for particular reasons. And that might be to emphasize a pause, for dramatic effect maybe, to trail off into silence, to indicate an unfinished thought, or to remove superfluous language which is generally understood and we don't need to add. Either it's irrelevant or it's just understood or inferred. So some appropriate uses of this punctuation. Unfortunately, I never heard back. This leaves the reader to think for themselves about why that might be. I'm sure you can imagine how that felt. Same sort of thing, we're putting it in the reader's hands to imagine how we felt. We're not going to write it ourselves. Inappropriate use. I think it's my favourite country I visited. Maybe we're talking about coming back from a holiday. This is just a sentence which needs no extra thought. If we wanted to add more description, we would add more description. We don't want to put it in the reader's hands or in the reader's mind without our extra language. There's no purpose to doing that. The photos you sent are all magnificent. Same sort of thing. If we add ellipses here, why would we be trailing off into silence? There is no unfinished thought. This is a finished thought. So we're not indicating that. And there's no superfluous language that we're removing either. We're not leaving it to the reader to imagine what we wanted to say. So ellipses is rare. If you're not confident using this punctuation, don't worry, leave it out. Doesn't matter. But if you do feel confident using this punctuation, then adding it may just show your vaster range of punctuation and your ability to use it in informal letters, which both shows your ability to create a consistent and appropriate tone and shows your range of punctuation as well. If we finish up, we're going to look at parentheses. And parentheses are words or statements which appear between brackets and are used to provide more explanation or context or as an afterthought. So some appropriate uses here. Jenny finally got the promotion she'd been asking about and deserving for years. You can almost imagine if we were saying this, we'd kind of change the tone of our voice to include that and deserving. It's not essential to the sentence. It provides a little bit more context as an afterthought. You can actually say this as Jenny finally got the promotion she'd been asking about for years, and she deserved it too, but it's better to put it in this construction here. If I were you, and sometimes I wish I was, I would seriously consider at least looking for positions elsewhere. Now notice here we're actually combining two of these punctuation marks. We have the brackets open and close to create that parentheses, and we have the exclamation mark as well because we are maybe making a bit of a joke and we've got that exclamation at the end that we want to emphasize that it's a bit of a joke. But more importantly, in terms of the parentheses, it's not essential to the sentence. In fact, we want to have it just as a joke in the background, okay? If we add it as part of the sentence, it might dilute the general sentence itself. So we want to put it in the background, so we put it in parentheses there. Inappropriate use. Just wanted to ask how the little ones are doing at their new school. Okay, this isn't really necessary. If I was reading this, I'd be like, why has this person put this in brackets? It's not necessary to do that. It's an important part of the sentence. We need it. By putting it in brackets, it sounds like you're trying to communicate some subtle point which I wouldn't understand. Another sentence, without wanting to be presumptuous, are you free this weekend for a little get together? Again, why is this in brackets? You really got to think about why you are placing things in brackets. It doesn't need to be in the background. It's quite an important thing. We don't want to be presumptuous, so we should just leave it outside of the brackets. No parenthesis needed here. Again, like ellipses, this punctuation feature is quite difficult to implement appropriately and accurately. So only use it if you're feeling pretty confident, if you're sort of aiming for that band 8, band 9 maybe. But if you don't feel so confident about using it, then it wouldn't harm your letter too much not to include it. But I thought it was useful to take the opportunity in this lecture on punctuation to describe certain punctuation features that you can use in informal letter writing, as I've already talked in general about punctuation in the Task 2 lecture, which, again, just to repeat myself, is available as a free lecture if you want to check that out. So I hope you found this lecture useful, and in the next lecture we're going to be talking about one of my favorite kind of sentences, conditional sentences.